listening to Bob Harden, streaming live online at bobharden.com.
Thanks so much for joining us here on the show. It's brought to you in part by the good folks at Johnson's Air Conditioning, Naples' longest established air conditioning company, as well as Naples Illustrated, bringing you infinite luxury lifestyles. Visit the website, naplesillustrated.com. Coming up, we're going to visit with David Bolduc. We'll be talking a little bit about private banking and its impact in the international banks. Right now we have with us Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He is the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. He's a former lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. He's the vice chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and further, the author of a terrific book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to hear you, Bob. Thanks for having me back.
Always a pleasure. Well, Doctor, right now we've seen the spread of ISIS and this organization, the attempt or the reality of establishing a caliphate state. Maybe you could give us your thoughts and ideas about what's happening.
Well, it continues to defy any of the plans and understanding of our administration of what's happening in Iraq, and sort of what happens when we start pulling out troops. Bottom line is a radical permutation of Al-Qaeda has now emanated out of Syria and is taking over a large swath of larger northern Iraq, and is run by this guy, al-Baghdadi. And you may have seen recently they actually attacked many of the Sunni 13 clerics in northern Iraq were killed who refused to participate with, now they call themselves just IS, Islamic State, because they think they've formed a state that is nullifying Syria and Iraq. And this has it's interesting, in the Wall Street Journal a month ago, they talked about how it's interesting how Assad had been bombing many of the neighborhoods in Aleppo and Damascus, but had avoided bombing ISIS strongholds. Yesterday, a report out of Israel said that over 50% of Syria's primary oil reserves have been controlled by ISIS, and yet Assad was not bombing them. So there's something very bizarre going on in that, as per the old paradigm, these dictators, as they try to control the moderate population, will allow the radicals to run roughshod. But I think Assad in some ways is losing control by the monster he allowed to be created.
So are there any good guys in this process? In other words, right now we know that Assad, in my view, should be overthrown, and it should be the people's government. But it just makes me wonder: is there any power there that for which you think the United States should support?
Well, I have family in Aleppo, and they continue to try to survive day to day, hand to mouth. And certainly there's no doubt that the number of moderates and good guys have decreased exponentially compared to what they were 3 years ago when the revolution started. However, having said that, you cannot believe that there still aren't good guys there. The good guys are the ones that are fighting for freedom against Assad and against ISIS and against the Islamists. ISIS was actually kicked out of Aleppo, as the New York Times reported, in what they call the promise of the radicals in Aleppo and the rebels, and that ISIS is the most radical of the radicals. So while we share many common enemies with some groups, that doesn't mean that those rebels in Aleppo are our friends. However, the bottom line is that what's our strategy? We've been we have a long history in the Cold War of knowing how to pick sides, and then knowing that once that conflict is done, helping provide another pathway for the emergence of a new, more moderate society. And I think in Syria, ultimately, first step is Assad has to go. Second step is the Islamists have to be defeated. We saw in Egypt Mubarak went, and then the Brotherhood came up and they were defeated. So similarly, we have to have a president and a State Department with a vision that first, you see the dictators leave and then the Islamists defeated, and nobody wants to have that conversation. And all the president did last week was ask for $500 million to go to the Syrian opposition, but didn't really articulate who that would be, how it would be vetted. And I think understandably the American public is just confused and would rather do nothing, which I think has proven to be one of the worst policies in history, is to basically doing nothing, which has allowed ISIS now to control just hundreds of if not 1,000 square miles.
Right. Now, I definitely believe what you're saying, that there are moderate people there. There are the good guys that we should support. Are they organized, and how do we figure out who they are?
They're not organized. They used to be in some of the towns. I think that the first step of vetting them is to say, well, what's your goal? Is it jihad? Is it an Islamic State? And that's the only good part about the evil of this ISIS is that, they're making their future plans clear. They want to have an Islamic State and a caliphate, which is clearly, as even Secretary Hagel said yesterday, these are directly against the interests of the United States and are creating a jihadist source for the entire planet. So, the moderates would be the ones that say that we want to have a Syrian state and Iraq that is unified under one government, that's pluralistic, that is not part of a jihadist response to either Assad or Maliki. And ultimately, I think that those Syrians, those Iraqis do exist, but they're becoming harder and harder to find in this very, very violent climate.
Well, and of course they're in a climate too where they speak out and they end up being dead, as you pointed out with some of the. Well, I believe in a previous interview where some of the clerics have been killed because they don't necessarily agree with ISIS. Exactly,
and actually just 4 days ago, 13 clerics were assassinated right after the Friday sermon of Baghdadi of the ISIS, who said that you either join the Islamic Caliphate movement with ISIS or you will be killed. And sure enough, they made examples of 13 clerics. And this is where America, Iraq, we had troops there. I think we should have maintained some like we did in Korea, South Korea, and Germany, elsewhere. And this is amazing to me how quick Iraq has fallen apart. And to see what we sacrificed, not only in money, but in our sons and daughters, to now be handed over into a radicalization of a huge part of where we were is just heartbreaking.
Heartbreaking indeed. For our listeners that may not be familiar with the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, Doctor, maybe you could tell us about it. What's it all about?
Yeah, our organization after 9/11 was formed. We believe that the source of radical Islam is not simply a violent ideology, but it's a political ideology that seeks, just like ISIS says, to create the Islamic State, and that the only solution to that is for Muslims to reform and the separation of mosque and state, no different than our Constitution and our First Amendment in America had an establishment clause, and that this modernity can happen within the Muslim consciousness, and Muslims, through our coalitions that we're forming, can begin to plant the ideas of Jeffersonian democracy and a republic and free speech, and against the ideas of apostasy and blasphemy and other aspects of Islamism. So basically, we're Muslims who are against Islamism, and I'd ask people to come to our website at aifdemocracy.org and help us build networks of reform.
aifdemocracy.org. I'm also going to encourage our listeners to read. I've read your book. It is a terrific opportunity to find out, first of all, about your faith. You're so transparent in what you write, but also getting some insight into this whole notion of Islamic jihad and political jihad. Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. A battle for the soul of Islam. Doctor, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate it.
My pleasure indeed. Okay, coming up, we're going to be visiting with David Bolduc. We'll be talking about something very controversial and so interesting to me about, banks and their impact on economies, especially when the international bank comes in. You may want to question whether you want to get involved with these folks. That and more right here on The Bob Harden Show on the Bob Harden Broadcasting Network.
Stay tuned for more of The Bob Harden Show here on the Bob Harden Broadcasting Network.